Okay, I think we're good. Had a little trouble with the software there, but I think we're up and running now. Let me know if you guys can hear me okay. Phil, I don't think that worked out too well for them in 1863. All right, let's do this. I'm excited about this one because, unfortunately, you guys are going to get inundated probably with Civil War content here and there over the next couple of weeks as I'm building up. Pretty excited about this trip to Vicksburg that's coming in a few weeks. 2 weeks from Tuesday, I will be headed to Vicksburg. So in just a little over 2 weeks. Advertising the new merch already. The hat. I actually haven't found a supplier that can make the hats inexpensive enough to make it available for merch. So this was like $30. So I got to find a way. I can't do it through the normal merch site that we use for YouTube, unfortunately. But I am going to be wearing this probably on my trips moving forward. So I'm excited about this one. As always, when we talk about specific events, specific historical time periods, things like that, please keep your questions to that. If you ask me questions that aren't related to that, that are about other parts of history, I probably will not answer them. So just so you know that going in, there are plenty of other times when we do those kinds of chats where you can kind of ask me anything. So Marty, glad to have you for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to use my friends, the American Battlefield Trust. They have a fantastic 20-minute video on the Vicksburg campaign that kind of walks through the major events associated with it. And this is actually, this stream will be linked in all of the videos that I make from these sites associated with the Vicksburg campaign. I'm going to visit pretty much every site they talk about here in my trip here in a couple of weeks. I'll have 4 days in the Vicksburg area, flying into Jackson, Mississippi. So I'll have all day Tuesday, all day Wednesday. Thursday we'll be doing the tour with anybody that wants to meet up, and then I'll have most of the day Friday before I fly home Friday night. So blue tongue. Actually, it's funny you mentioned that, 'cause it's actually green, but because of the black green screen, it'll probably show up as black on the stream because it's green. I was eating some apple heads and they turned my tongue green. So yeah, there's that. So it's not actually blue. It's just the way it probably is showing up on the green screen. Hello from the birthplace of Edwin Stanton. That's right down the road from me. Wasn't he born in Steubenville? That's like an hour away from me. Eric, Civil War buff. Very cool. So, was Braxton Bragg truly the worst general of the war? No, I don't think he was the worst. They're like lemon heads, but they're apple. All right, so we're going to go ahead and dive into this, and then we'll stop. And if you guys have questions at any point, we'll try to answer those best we can. But in my mind, Vicksburg is not only the real turning point of the American Civil War, much more so than Gettysburg, but also Vicksburg, I believe, from the time when the gunboats run the guns at Vicksburg and get south of the city. From the time Grant uses those boats to get across the river and he's on Mississippi soil south of Vicksburg, from that point to the surrender of Vicksburg, I think is the most brilliant campaign of the war. And we'll talk about that. There were some mistakes. There were some hiccups along the way. It didn't go perfectly. Took Grant the better part of a year to take Vicksburg. But once he got there, it was done. Yeah, it'll talk about Grist in a little bit, I think. Let me know if the volume's okay on the video.
By the end of the Civil War's second year, Union forces in the West controlled much of the Mississippi River, except for one vital stretch, Few Northern boats tested the strong Confederate river batteries at Port Hudson or at Vicksburg.
So, just stop right there, right off the bat. You know, we don't talk much about New Orleans because New Orleans fell relatively easily at the beginning of the war, pretty much just to the Navy. New Orleans was by far the largest city in the Confederacy. I think Richmond was the second largest city in the Confederacy, and New Orleans was like 7 times larger than Richmond. So it wasn't even close. So Vicksburg was the northern point, as you can see, to which the Union did not have control of the Mississippi. Port Hudson in Louisiana is the southern point that they don't have access to. And so the Vicksburg campaign is not just about Vicksburg. It's kind of a two-pronged campaign where you're always going to have one Union force trying to take Port Hudson and one trying to take Vicksburg. And I don't know how much he'll talk about what led up to this, but if he doesn't, I will go back and adjust that. So the Battlefield Trust is volume's a little too high. Okay, good to know. We'll see if this is better.
Known as the Gibraltar of the Confederacy, President Abraham Lincoln claimed Vicksburg the key to winning the Civil War. But by late 1862, Union naval efforts there had failed. That key remained firmly in Southern hands. Using the Mississippi River and its...
Marty, no, I believe the Damn the Torpedoes Full Speed Ahead was Mobile. I might double check that, but I'm pretty sure that was Mobile. Yeah, so there were the entrance going into New Orleans. There were these two forts, Fort Jackson and Fort St. Philip, I think was the other one. And once they got past those, it was pretty much done. Was Lincoln self-taught in military strategy? Yeah, and honestly, more often than not, Lincoln was probably better off to just back off and let his generals do their thing. But so let's talk about, yeah, it was the Mobile campaign.
Major tributaries to move men and munitions. The Union Army had won a series of victories in the West, and they hadn't done it alone.
So let's talk about a couple of things right here with this. First of all, one of the brilliant things about Grant's entire strategy in the West was his coordination with the Navy, which really did not exist anywhere else during the Civil War, at least not to that degree. Grant was really, really good at logistics. He understood the science of moving an army. He understood what it took to move supplies. He had been a quartermaster in the Mexican War, so this was something he had background in. And so the reason Fort Henry and Fort Donelson, all of this matters because this is all connected to the Vicksburg campaign. So Fort Henry was relatively easy to take. It was on the Tennessee River over here on this side. And then the Cumberland River, which runs into Nashville, is where Fort Donelson was. The two rivers are like 12 miles apart at one place, and that's where the forts were. Henry was on like here, and then Donelson was here, and so there was land between the two. Henry was basically, neither one of these were really forts in the sense like Fort Sumter was a fort. They were basically just earthen breastworks. Fort Henry fell without firing a shot, basically, by the Army. By the time Grant arrived with the Army, the Navy had already taken Fort Henry. Fort Donelson took a little bit more. We're not going to talk too much about all of that, but once Fort Donelson fell, Nashville was undefensible, and so Nashville was evacuated of Confederate troops after Donelson fell. And so once Grant took both of those, he immediately wanted to move on Corinth. Grant was a guy who was all about action. He was all about wanting to get stuff done. But the problem was he didn't have the authority to do that. He only controlled the troops kind of in this area right here. Henry Halleck was over everything in the west. Don Carlos Buell controlled the troops in this area. Eventually, Halleck finally puts Grant in command of everything in western Tennessee. He marches down near where Shiloh is, and he sets up camp here near the Tennessee River while he waits for Buell's army to arrive so they can march on Corinth. Corinth's a rail hub, and that's going to be kind of their jumping off point for taking Vicksburg. Long story short, the Battle of Shiloh happens because Johnston doesn't want to wait for Grant to get Buell's army. So he marches north from Corinth to try to hit him. That's what Shiloh happens. But rain slows him down. They eventually march back down after the Battle of Shiloh. They take Corinth, and now Corinth becomes the jumping off point for the next phase of the war, which is going to be taking Vicksburg. All right, let me catch up on chat here. What was Grant's biggest fault? Grant's biggest fault, especially early in the war, was a lack of... I think he underestimated his enemy. Especially at Shiloh. He certainly did that at Fort Donelson. There were times he didn't prepare as well as he should for every eventuality. Shiloh he didn't entrench because he didn't think that the enemy would leave Corinth. So he was kind of unprepared. And he could be bullheaded. When he decided he was going to do something, he was going to do it regardless of whether or not it was the best idea or not.
In late 1861, the U.S. War Department...
Wait, William, what are you talking about? A shill for the Union side? Please explain that a little more. I'd like to hear what you mean by that.
...had rapidly built a fleet of ironclad riverboats never before seen in warfare. By late 1862, this brown water navy and Major General Ulysses S. Grant's army set their sights on the city that Confederate President Jefferson Davis claimed was the nailhead that held the South's two halves together. With most of the South's ports blockaded by Union ships, Vicksburg's connection to the Trans-Mississippi region made it critical to the Confederacy's very survival.
All right, so a couple things real quick, and then I'll get to some of these questions. Vicksburg is vital because it's not only kind of a really heavily fortified position that's up on some bluffs above the city or above the Mississippi River. It's also a vital rail hub that connects to Jackson, connects up to Memphis, connects down here. So especially food was a big supply from Texas and places like that, and it had to get across. And if you don't control the Mississippi River, you can't get your supplies across. So you really are getting cut in half. Okay. Tim makes a good point. Grant had a major issue when it came to his reputation with his peers and his seniors. And a lot of that went back to the old Army because Grant basically had to resign from the Army over his drinking when he was kind of bored on the West Coast. And because of that reputation, he often got accused by rivals of being drunk when he wasn't. Now, I'm not saying Grant didn't have some issues with that during the war. I think it's not fair to say he was an alcoholic so much as he was a binge drinker who couldn't hold his liquor. He would binge drink, and then he would go months without touching the stuff. And people knew that, and so they would accuse him of it even when it wasn't true. But in Lincoln's defense, to his credit, he didn't listen to those people, but he would send people like Charles Dana from the War Department to go be with Grant so he could report back and tell him what was going on. Halleck actually sends McPherson to kind of keep an eye on Grant, and McPherson ends up being one of Grant's most trusted generals and a good friend. Will thinks I cater to the Union too much. I call it like I see it, and I think you'll find that I am a much more sympathetic to the South than Atten Shea, for example. All right, let me just catch up on a few more things and then we'll go. There was another question somebody had that I want to mention. I wanted to address. What point do you think could have caused the South to have a victory in the war? The only chance for them to win was European intervention. And no, I don't think Grant was nearly as brutal as some textbooks paint him. Yeah, and so Grant has... We're not getting very far in this video right now, but that's okay because it's a stream, and that's the point of talking about this. We're not doing a trivia and chat stream today. I don't know when we'll do another one. John Rawlings is actually a big key to Grant's story because Grant is working as a a clerk in his father's store in Galena, Illinois. He'd only been in Galena for about a year. And the war breaks out, and he's working as this clerk, and it's okay. It's work. John Rawlings is kind of a politician, and he's giving a speech as they're trying to raise their troops for Lincoln's 75,000 volunteers. And he comes in, and he's in Galena, and he meets up with Grant, and he tells Grant, you've got a West Point education. You need to get out there and offer your services to the governor of Illinois. And so when Grant first gets appointed as a regimental commander and then a brigadier general, he brings Rawlings in as his chief of staff. And Rawlings was the guy who kind of held him accountable when it came to his drinking and really protected him in that way throughout the war. And he ends up being Grant's Secretary of War when Grant became president, but he dies in office. And then Sherman actually serves as the interim Secretary of War till they can appoint somebody.
Texas beef and Louisiana sugar, salt, and molasses fed the Southern armies. Lead from Missouri filled Southern rifles, and it all funneled through Vicksburg's rail lines. The defense of Vicksburg and Port Hudson fell to Lieutenant General John Pemberton,
born in Pennsylvania.
Who was a Pennsylvanian by birth, but sided with the South at the urging of his wife, a Virginian. With little combat experience, his orders are to hold Vicksburg at all costs. In late 1862, Grant began his campaign for Vicksburg with a two-pronged strike, intending to lure Confederate forces from Vicksburg with the first prong, while the second, commanded by Major General William Sherman, struck at the city's lightly held defenses.
Cheyenne, most Confederate generals did not come from the north. There were a few, but most Confederate generals came from the south. By and large, people fought for whatever side their state was in. There were exceptions to that. George Thomas was from Virginia, fought for the North. Pemberton was from Pennsylvania, fought for the South. In some cases, they had ties that drew them to a state beside their home state. Or in some cases, they just stayed loyal to the Union. The Union general who fled the battlefield with his corps commanders was William Rosecrans at the Battle of Chickamauga, with two of his three corps commanders. Sherman and Grant name a more iconic duo. I'll wait. Somebody mentioned Sherman's quote about his mental illness, and I'm going to do a video sometime on Sherman's mental illness because it's much more severe than people realize. It was really, really bad, and it's a small miracle that Sherman ended up. Honestly, Grant and Sherman both. It's a small miracle that either one of those guys ended up in high command with some of the stuff that happened with them early in the war. So Sherman, at the beginning of the war, he's a brigade commander at the the first Battle of Bull Run. After that, he's sent west. He's in Louisville, Kentucky, in charge of troops in that area, and he starts saying stuff like, "We're going to need 200,000 men to keep Kentucky in the Union," and he just gets really kind of paranoid about the Confederates, to the point where people are seriously concerned about his mental health. And he says later he seriously contemplated suicide, and the only thing that kept him from suicide was his children. There's a lot more to it than that, but he ends up kind of getting a second chance. It's Halleck that gives him a second chance. And after Fort Donelson, they're putting together a new division for Grant's army as he marches south toward Corinth, and Sherman's giving command of that division. And so it's at the Battle of Shiloh that Sherman and Grant first kind of get to know each other well, and they're both kind of hurt at Shiloh. Grant had a horse fall on his leg and hurt his leg. He was on crutches. Sherman was shot in the hand during the battle. But that's where their partnership begins. And so by the time you get to the Vicksburg campaign, Sherman has already become one of Grant's most trusted subordinates, especially because Grant's second in command, who is John McClernand, can't be trusted.
But Confederate cavalry hit first, cutting Grant's long supply line, forcing him to fall back and allowing Confederates to shift men by rail to defeat Sherman's attacks at Chickasaw Bayou.
So let's talk about that for a second, because this was an important lesson for Grant. I want to back up and see if I can find a map showing you some of that early part of the Vicksburg campaign, because they kind of gloss over that pretty quickly. So right here, you have Grant coming down from Bolivar, which is east of Memphis. And so he's moving down, and at this point, Vicksburg is very lightly defended. Thank you, Michael. Very lightly defended, and so Grant is trying to keep the focus on him while Sherman goes down to take Vicksburg, and it gets really, really close. And this Battle of Chickasaw Bayou is one I'm pretty familiar with, because I had a couple of ancestors who fought at that battle. In fact, let me show you how brutal it was. This is what their flag looked like after that battle. Let me see if I can get it a little bigger for you. This is the flag of the 22nd Kentucky Infantry after the Battle of Chickasaw Bayou, sometimes called Chickasaw Bluffs. It was bad. It was bad, and the reason it was bad is because Sherman was expecting light defense. But because of Van Dorn's raid, and because the Confederate cavalry got in behind Grant and cut off his supply lines, Grant had to retreat, which means he couldn't keep that pressure up, which means the troops that would have had to face Grant were then able to come down here and take on Sherman. And so Sherman ended up facing a much stronger Confederate force than he was expecting. Is it a real Civil War battle of none of my ancestors? Lots of battles none of my ancestors were in. I didn't have any ancestors in any of the Eastern Campaign in 1864, unfortunately. My wife did, but I didn't. No, I take that back. I had one in the 4th Pennsylvania Cavalry, so he was in all those battles. Josh Wood, don't know exactly what's going to be next after Vicksburg. It might be the Little Bighorn out in Montana. There are not any Grant films. There's a documentary that History Channel did a while back.
Late December. Grant spends the winter and early spring of 1863 trying a variety of routes to Vicksburg, each ending in failure.
So take a look right here. And one of the tricky things about Vicksburg is when I go there is that the Mississippi River actually occasionally changes course. So it actually does not flow the same way today that it did 160 years ago. But at the time, you can see here how the Mississippi River has this big bend right here, right as it hits Vicksburg. And the big problem for Grant was that he was trying to get south of the city with his troops without having to send supplies and gunboats past the defenses of Vicksburg, because it's really strongly defended. And so he spends quite a while trying to dig a canal from here to there so they can bypass the Mississippi River with their gunboats and just go right through here, or bypass Vicksburg with their gunboats. It fails, and they lose a lot of men because of malaria and illness and all sorts of things. And so that fails. And so eventually, after 6 months of trying, well, not 6 months, well, probably close to 6 months of trying to figure out how to get at Vicksburg, Grant finally says, you know what, forget it. We're just going to run past the battery. So we're just going to run the gunboats past and take our chances. And Sherman, among others, thought it was going to be a disaster. It was going to be a really, really bad idea. But it ended up working out pretty well.
Amidst growing public cries to replace him, and against the advice of his closest advisors, Grant grew bolder, embarking upon the largest amphibious campaign in American history up to that time. In late March, Grant orders Major General John McClernand's 13th Corps to improve the route across Louisiana's swampy river bottoms. Out of the reach of Vicksburg's big guns, the Union force would then be ferried across the mighty river and onto Mississippi soil. Grant's plan is intricate, risky. Success hinges on Admiral David Porter's fleet of gunboats and troop transports, which on the night of April 16th make a daring race past the Vicksburg batteries, hugging the riverbank below to withstand their fire.
So these are the gunboats. They're ironclads for the most part, also some timberclads. The problem with these gunboats is that the top is not protected. The sides have the ironclad thing going on, but the top is not protected. And so if you can put plunging fire down on them, you can wreak havoc. And this happened at places like Fort Donelson, where the Navy pretty much had to withdraw with heavy losses from the battle for Fort Donelson because of that plunging fire wreaking havoc on them. So they were concerned about that happening. So what they do is they hug the river as close to Vicksburg as they can, and they end up finding out that most of the batteries in Vicksburg can't depress low enough to fire on the gunships. They had actually lit fires on the opposite side of the river so they'd be able to see what was happening. But it worked out, and they were able, with I think one, maybe two exceptions, to get all the gunboats down the river.
Even with Porter's fleet south of Vicksburg, Grant continues to keep Pemberton guessing as to where he'll attack. On April 17th, the day after Porter's daring run, Grant launches a federal cavalry raid into the heart of Mississippi.
And that doesn't get talked about much either. Grierson's raid is right up there with some of the great cavalry raids of the war. And the reason that all of this matters is that it keeps you focused behind you. You know, if you're in Vicksburg, you're worried about what's happening back here. And there's another army under Joe Johnston that's over around Jackson that we'll see soon. And so we're keeping those guys busy so they don't notice what's happening over here.
On April 29th, Sherman feints an attack north of Vicksburg, while Union gunboats shell Grand Gulf, where Grant actually plans to ferry his army across the Great River. The cavalry raid ties up Pemberton's cavalry, leaving river crossings unguarded. Sherman's feint draws Confederate attention north of the city. Both keep Pemberton distracted from the true threat at Grand Gulf. The batteries there were too strong for Union gunboats, so Grant adapts and crosses instead at Bruinsburg.
And this is the start of where it's really pretty brilliant. This is why Grant's underrated in this way. Grant is a good strategic thinker. He's able to think outside of immediately what's in front of him. He's thinking about, how do I make this easier? Not only for what we're doing here, but elsewhere. He's already thinking several steps ahead, and he'll do this throughout the Vicksburg campaign. He's thinking several steps ahead. He's thinking like a chess player, whereas Robert E. Lee tended to only focus on what was immediately in front of him and dealing with that. And he very rarely did things that were in the best strategic interest, although Lee didn't have the luxury of being able to do that the same way Grant did.
Grant adapts and crosses instead at Bruinsburg. By April 30th, Grant realizes a goal he had toiled 6 months to achieve. The lead element of his army is on the Confederate side of the river. For the next...
Wait, the game was on sale. Where are you in Glasgow? And please go have a pint at the Old Toll for me. Yeah, Salazar, you're absolutely right, and I think that's why Grant's underrated as a general. When Grant got across the river, once they ran the gunboats ran the batteries at Vicksburg, in Grant's mind it was a fait accompli. It was Vicksburg is going to fall. It's just a matter of how quickly does it fall. Now, he was a little overly optimistic. He actually thought that Vicksburg was going to fall within a few days after they ran the gunboats down the river, but took a little longer than that.
Next 17 days, his army would march more than 200 miles and fight 5 battles in a campaign never before witnessed on American soil.
Phil, Lee didn't have the supplies Grant had, but he also didn't have the supply issues that Grant had. Lee never had to supply an army over hundreds and hundreds of miles for months and months and months the way that Grant did.
Moving inland, up steep bluffs, marched the soldiers of McClernand's Corps. In the early morning hours of May 1st, they hit a Confederate brigade. For the next 17 hours, up to 8,000 Confederates put up a noble defense in the rugged terrain surrounding Fort Gibson, holding back 20,000 Federals. By late afternoon, outflanked and low on ammunition, the Confederates fall back. The loss here causes the...
I think my car's alarm might be going off. Give me a second here, guys. I guess it wasn't mine. All right, let's back up a little bit. I want to talk about Port Gibson for a minute because when I do my videos, when I get there, my ancestor was in Logan's division, and the guy that was in their same regiment that kept a journal of what was happening talked about Port Gibson and how they had marched all day long in Logan's division to get there because they heard the sound of the battle. But by the time they got there, they said it was all over. They said McClernand's Corps had taken care of business. They had won. There was nothing for us to do. We didn't have to fight anymore. But then they immediately get asked to march even further north. So even though they had been marching all day, they were asked to keep going. These soldiers, what they did during this Vicksburg campaign was incredible. You know, it's right up there with Jackson's foot cavalry as far as what he did in the Valley campaign. Marching from one battle to the next, fighting one unit, then another unit, then another with very little sleep. They're cut loose from their supply base. So a lot of times they only had a day or two of rations and they had to forage and things like that.
Holding back 20,000 Federals. By late afternoon, outflanked and low on ammunition, the Confederates fall back. The loss here causes the Confederate evacuation of Grand Gulf on May 2nd. With his beachhead secure, Grant's plan truly unfolds. Now, aware of Grant's true intentions, Pemberton assumes he will march north for Vicksburg. But Grant has already rejected that approach as too restrictive. Instead,
So let's think about this for a second, okay? Pemberton, who's defending Vicksburg, thinks Grant's going to come north and hit us at Vicksburg. Pemberton's got about 30,000 men in Vicksburg. Grant says, no, that's too restrictive. Now, most generals, if I was a general, I would have thought the same thing, would think Vicksburg's the prize. You're after Vicksburg. You've been trying to get Vicksburg for 6 or 8 months. Just march up there and take it. But Grant says, no, I'm not thinking that small. I'm thinking big picture here. It's more than just about Vicksburg. What happens if I take Vicksburg? Am I going to be able to hold it? What's going to happen next? So again, thinking 4 or 5 moves down the road. So he's thinking big picture here, and this is what sets Grant apart from a lot of other generals and why he's not just the butcher who bludgeoned Lee to death with large numbers. He was a strategic thinker.
Using the Big Black River as a shield, he plans to cut the rail line which feeds Vicksburg with supplies and reinforcements. Then he will turn and trap Pemberton at Vicksburg. It was this type of bold, indirect strategy that would become the hallmark of Grant's military career. By May 12th, joined by Sherman's Corps, Grant marches along a 10-mile front, aiming to attack the Southern Railroad the next morning.
So here are the 3 corps commanders that he's got. You've got John McClernand, who's a political appointee. He's a war Democrat. He's Grant's second in command at this point, and he has done nothing but undermine Grant from the moment he started serving under him. He thinks he should be in command. He has done all kinds of stuff behind the scenes trying to undermine Grant. Grant knows this. Grant wants to get rid of McClernand, but he can't do it. And part of the reason why is because McClernand's backed by Lincoln, because Lincoln needs war Democrats. It's the same reason Lincoln doesn't fire McClellan until after the 1862 elections. You know, he wanted to fire McClellan much sooner, but he didn't want to anger Democrats who supported the war. And so it's actually right in the middle of the Vicksburg campaign that Grant finally gets his excuse to remove McClernand, when McClernand goes and pops off to some reporters about stuff that he had been directly ordered not to talk about to reporters. That gave Grant the excuse to finally remove him from command. The other ones, of course, are Sherman, McPherson. McPherson will end up being killed outside of Atlanta in 1864. He's the only Army commander who's killed during the entire war on the Union side. Full-size army. I'm not like Nathaniel Lyon didn't command a big army, but
Pemberton shifts his army and rushes a Confederate brigade by rail to Jackson with orders to strike Grant's right flank. These 3,000 Confederates slam into Major General James McPherson's 10,000 men along the banks of 14 Mile Creek.
And this battle, the Battle of Raymond, my ancestor in the 20th Ohio, this is, they're at Shiloh, they're at Vicksburg, they're at Atlanta, they're at all these battles, but Raymond is the battle where they take the most casualties of any battle. The 20th Ohio was right on the front lines of this. And it was this massive Union force, an entire corps, and like basically one brigade attacks them, the Confederates. It was a foolhardy attack, but it was an attempt to try and slow the Union down a little bit, but it did not end well for them.
Just southwest of Raymond. Unaware that they are outnumbered 3-1, Confederates launch a fierce attack. After almost 6 hours, McPherson's artillery and numeric advantage has the rebels retreating to Jackson. Realizing he can't safely march on Vicksburg with a large body of Confederates now at his rear, Grant wields 2/3 of his army toward the state capital. He cuts rail and telegraph lines along the way and hinders communication between Pemberton and the one man sent to assist him. On the night of May 13th, General Joe Johnston, the hero of 1st Manassas, arrives at Jackson to take charge of the grim Confederate predicament in Mississippi.
Now, in Grant's autobiography, he talks a lot about the generals who served under him, but also the generals he opposed. And Joe Johnston, he probably speaks higher of Joe Johnston than he does of Robert E. Lee. Grant had very high opinion of Joe Johnston as a commander during the war. And he felt, I think, if I'm reading between the lines of what Grant said, I think Grant was relatively surprised that Johnston didn't have command in the West from that point on. Joe Johnston had been the commander in the East. He was wounded during the Peninsular Campaign. I think it was the Battle of Seven Pines. He was wounded and he was replaced by Robert E. Lee at that point. And then Johnston eventually gets sent west, and he ends up commanding at the end, surrenders to Sherman. But Grant thought very, very highly of Joe Johnston. And Johnston was sent to try and help relieve Vicksburg, but he never got to Vicksburg. He didn't want to risk losing his army in Vicksburg as well. What he really needed to do was somehow get Pemberton's force out of Vicksburg and into the open so they could fight a battle against Grant, and it never happened. Yeah, let me see if I can turn on the closed captions for you for that. There we go.
Within hours, even as his reinforcements near Jackson, Johnston wires the authorities in Richmond that he is too late and orders the city evacuated. The next morning, Sherman and McPherson's divisions push back Confederate artillery and roadblocks from a handful of Confederate regiments. By late afternoon on May 14th, the United States flag flies once again over the state capitol. Grant spares none of his men to occupy Jackson and put its military supplies and rail lines to the torch.
So, Johnston's doing the right thing at this point. Johnston realizes, if I don't pull back, I'm just going to end up like Pemberton is, and I'm going to lose this army, and then we're going to have nobody to fight Grant. So he pulls out. But that pretty much seals Pemberton's fate. And Grant doesn't wait around. He's moving. This is fast. This is kind of 19th century blitzkrieg. It's hit Jackson, burn what can be used by the Confederates, now immediately turn and let's go deal with Vicksburg.
Then he turns his army toward Vicksburg. As Jackson burned, Pemberton had moved with 20,000 men to attack Grant's supply line. Without a working telegraph, Confederate communications unravel. As Johnston gathers reinforcements to the northeast, Pemberton moves southeast. On May...
So here's the problem for Pemberton, and let's back up here. He waits too long to make a move. He's been sitting in Vicksburg this whole time while Grant was attacking Raymond, attacking Jackson. At any point there, he could have been moving out to help Johnston, and maybe they could have made a stand. He waits until Johnston has retreated from Jackson, and only now, when Grant's got all three of his corps moving toward Vicksburg, does he decide to move out of Vicksburg to make a stand. And this will culminate in what I think is the decisive battle of the Civil War, which is the Battle of Champion Hill.
His reinforcements to the northeast, Pemberton moves southeast. On May 16th, Pemberton received a 2-day-old message from Johnston, ordering him to Clinton. As Pemberton reverses his column, Grant closes in. Pemberton hastily deploys his divisions along a 3-mile front to face 2 advancing Federal columns, but he is unaware of a third moving toward his exposed left flank.
And this is where intelligence comes into this. He's got his army ready to receive an attack from what he believes are just 2 columns. And here's Osterhaus, who was born in Germany, I believe, one of many German-born officers in the Union Army. And a prominent commander in the Western Theater throughout the war. But they have no idea that this 3rd column's coming over here on Carter Stevenson's left flank. Marcus, yes, I'm hoping to visit some other countries as well, and there will be definitely posts about that as we get along. So whoever asked me when I'm coming to Vicksburg, August 19th is the meetup day for anybody who wants to be there. I posted a video yesterday about this. August 19th at 10 a.m. we're going to meet at the Visitor Center and tour the battlefield together. I think Champion Hill is more decisive. I think Big Black River, it was already decided at that point.
Brigadier General Stephen Lee of Stevenson's division shifts his brigade to a hill owned by Sid Champion. Brigadier General Alfred Cummings Georgians moved to fill a gap and block the Union division's closing on the Middle Road. And at 10:30 that morning at Champion Hill, Grant starts the battle, destined to seal Vicksburg's eventual fate. If Pemberton's thin left flank crumbles, Grant will control the Baker's Creek Bridge and Pemberton's escape route to Vicksburg. Seth Barton's Georgia Brigade hustles to stop the Union onslaught. By 11:30 a.m., the fighting on Champion Hill turns viciously hand-to-hand, with Stevenson's division eventually thrown back to the Jackson Road. Major General John Bowen's division savagely drives the Federals back to the Champion House. But a second Federal assault overwhelms them. Reinforcements led by Major General William Loring arrive too late, and Bowen's men fall back. Their retreat turns to panic as Grant's divisions converge. Their main escape route now cut off. Pemberton's men had managed to construct a second bridge, which they used to retreat to Edwards. Though not
now, this is the one, and Champion Hill is one of the spots I'm most excited to see. This is the one thing I think Grant probably wishes could have gone differently, is that I think he probably would have liked to catch Pemberton in the open and get behind him. Crocker and Logan were attempting to do that and cut him off and avoid a siege, and he's not able to do that. Pemberton's able to get his army back and into the defensive works inside the city.
Before Grant's army is able to strand Loring on the east side of Baker's Creek. Out of communication with Pemberton, and believing Grant has already taken Edwards, Loring orders his vital 8,000-man division to Jackson and away from the defenses at Vicksburg. Unaware of Loring's decision, Pemberton waits for him that night in the fortification at the Big Black River Bridge. Instead, he is met the next morning by McClernand's corps, which immediately attack and send the rebels running to the safety of Vicksburg. The battles at Champion Hill and Big Black River cost Pemberton dearly. 25% of his army, 45 cannon, and the faith of his men.
And at this point, it's over. And when they say the faith of his men, at one point during the siege of Vicksburg, some men anonymously send a note to Pemberton that says something like, "My God, if you're," or I think it says, "If you're not going to feed us, then by God surrender us," something like that. Halleck is involved. At this point, General Halleck is the commander-in-chief of the Union Army, so he is Grant's superior back in Washington. They called Halleck Old Brains. Halleck was not a good field commander, but he was a smart guy who, like, had a lot of knowledge, but didn't know how to apply it on the battlefield. And so a staff position was his best place. And after Grant is promoted to general-in-chief, Halleck is made the chief of staff. So he still works in Washington. He's still kind of the liaison in the War Department for the military, but he's no longer in command.
30 years ago, to the day, Pemberton had accepted a cadetship to West Point. As he rode back to Vicksburg, he notes, and today that career is ended in disaster and disgrace. Grant's trap is now set.
And honestly, Big Black River Bridge, while it was a major blunder, I don't think it changed the outcome all that much. I think after Champion Hill, that was decided. So yes, it was a huge screw up, and Pemberton did get screwed by what happened there. I'm not entirely sure it mattered all that much.
On May 17th, Pemberton's demoralized soldiers, reeling from the loss at Big Black River, began streaming into the city. They worked through the night to shore up their fortifications. Vicksburg's land defenses stretched more than 8 miles, with 9 major forts connected by rifle pits, artillery embrasures, and parapets of earthen logs. One such stockade redan guarded the graveyard road leading into Vicksburg. Wanting to avoid a lengthy siege, Grant attacked here on May 19th. After a 5-hour artillery barrage, Sherman goes in, but piles of brush and sharpened tree limbs unravel formations as Confederate crossfire cuts men down in scores. Pinned down, Confederates lob hand grenades into their midst. The Federals used.
So there's something you don't hear a lot about. There's something you don't hear a lot about during the war, but this was actually something that existed throughout the Civil War. Hand grenades. They were basically artillery pieces, or like artillery shells, explosive artillery shells with fuses on them that you lit and threw. I mean, it was really that simple. And this was something that happened a lot during the siege battles. Happened in the East late in the war, but it also happened here. And a lot of what you'll see at Petersburg, you see first at Vicksburg. The digging of mines, for example. They exploded one mine, much like they did at the crater a year later, but they actually had 12 or 13 more of them that they were digging at the time that Vicksburg finally surrendered. So they would have had all of these mines going off in the near future. So Grant was getting ready, even if they hadn't surrendered, Grant was getting ready to just blow holes all over the lines. Cartoon Acme bombs, yes. That's about right.
Back to their lines. Almost 1,000 of Grant's men are killed, wounded or missing. Behind his stout defenses, Pemberton loses only 70. On May 20th...
Think about that for a second. The Confederates lose 70 men and Grant loses 1,000 on that first assault. And then the second assault comes a couple of days later, and again, major casualties. And in this particular case, this is where, I think one of the times where Grant... this is where Grant decides he's going to have to settle in for a siege, but it's also one of the final straws between McClernand and Grant, because McClernand is convinced that he had Vicksburg, had the defenses breached, and that it was Grant's fault for not sending him enough reinforcements to support him. But Grant said, and Sherman later backed this up, that McClernand did not have nearly the breakthrough that he thought he did when he was sending for reinforcements.
Second, Grant tries again on a much wider 3-mile front. Only McClernand's corps gains a foothold. He sends Grant a message to keep up the pressure. But they are beaten back and lose another 3,000 men. Grant realizes he has no other choice but to lay siege, ordering his commanders to dig their lines closer to the Confederate trenches. By mid-June, they began mining beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, and on June 25th, the Federals explode 2,200 pounds of black powder. Soldiers from both sides pour into the crater, fighting for more than 20 hours before Grant calls off the attacks.
And that should be Grant. Some of these captions aren't great. Yeah, the crater before the crater. Everybody talks about the crater at Petersburg, but there was a crater at Vicksburg too. And like I said, there were going to be a whole bunch more of them if Vicksburg hadn't surrendered when it did.
By July 6th, the Federals will be prepared to detonate 13 more mines, but it will not be necessary. For 47 days, soldiers and Vicksburg citizens endure a constant nightmare. Day and night, up to 220 cannon blast the southern defenses from the land as Porter's gunboats shelled Vicksburg's batteries from the river.
Grant actually takes a bunch of huge guns from the Navy and brings them in to help with the siege. In fact, let me see if I can find a picture of some of these guns and show you what I'm talking about with some of the guns that Grant had. So here you go. This is from the National Park Service. Constructed in a hurry, the U.S. Navy armed the USS Cairo and the rest of the City-class gunboats with whatever armament they could find. Over time, the original guns would be replaced and upgraded. So this is on the Navy ship, and the Cairo's there. They pulled it up from the water, and you can see it today. Cairo had 3 8-inch smoothbores, 3 42-pound rifles, 6 32-pound smoothbores, and 1 30-pound rifle. They could fire a 32-pound cannonball about a mile. I want to try and find some of the ones they had for the siege, though. Let me see if I can find those for you. Because some of these guns they had were absolutely enormous. So here you go. Here's a good example of one. Let me see if I can zoom in on it, and then I'll drag it over to the camera. So this is what's called Battery Sherman right here. Look at the size of those guns that they had. And they had even bigger ones. They had some mortars as well that would lob shells up and over and into the city. I mean, they just had massive artillery pieces. Now, the Confederates had some strong artillery pieces as well. It just wasn't a one-sided thing. I should point that out.
Citizens took to living in hillside caves for shelter. Food and water grow scarce. As disease flourishes, medical supplies dwindle. Every public building and many homes are now hospitals. Wagons make daily rounds to pick up the dead. Rebel soldiers' rations are by now a handful of peas and rice and a single cup of water per day. Sickness and desertion leave fewer men on the front lines. One day in late June, a notice slid under the door of Pemberton's headquarters. It reads, "If you can't feed us, surrender us. Signed, many soldiers." Following a dire report from his subordinates that his army lacks the strength to make a breakout attack, on July 2nd, Pemberton realizes he has no choice. He must surrender.
Now, remember, what's Grant known as in the Northern papers now? Unconditional surrender Grant, U.S. Grant. Because at Fort Donelson, Buckner, who's the guy who's left in defense of Fort Donelson, had been a friend of Grant's from before the war. And Grant still said unconditional surrender, which unconditional surrender means basically all of your men are going to prison camps in the North. You're surrendering all of your weapons, everything to me. You're going to walk out of here with the clothes on your back on your way to a prison camp, and that's it. But he doesn't do that here. He does not demand unconditional surrender like he does with Lee, like he does with Fort Donelson.
On July 3rd, 1863, there came a sound, ominous for some, for weeks unheard by all. Silence. That day, Grant and Pemberton meet to discuss terms of surrender. With the anniversary of American independence only a day away, Pemberton hopes Grant will be in a generous mood.
The reason not asking for unconditional surrender, so by not doing an unconditional surrender, for example, what you're offering are paroles, which is what happens here. Grant doesn't need to take 30,000 prisoners. There's no real great benefit to having to deal with that. So a conditional surrender, one in which he's going to offer parole, he's going to let these guys surrender your guns, surrender your slaves, because that was a point of it. Pemberton tries to get Grant to agree to let everyone leave with their personal property. And Grant says, you can keep your horses, you can keep your sidearms, but you're not taking your slaves with you. So he paroles them all. And there's actually a benefit to that, because you send these guys back to their hometowns, and they're going to report what happened. And hopefully that's going to bring down morale some.
Instead, Grant demands unconditional surrender. Pemberton refuses. Later that evening, Grant offers terms. Instead of taking Pemberton's army prisoner, he will parole them. Many will go home at once. Pemberton accepts, and on the 4th of July, the Confederates stack arms, handing over the city of Vicksburg to the Union forces. The South's Gibraltar had fallen. With the capture of Port Hudson, 5 days later, the Mississippi River is entirely in Union hands.
And that's the other thing people don't talk about is while Grant's doing that, Port Hudson is falling. Remember at the beginning, Port Hudson is the southern piece of that puzzle, the southern boundary of Confederate control of the Mississippi. Vicksburg's the northern boundary, and so the two of them then together, now you've got complete control of the Mississippi.
Grant loses 10,000 killed, wounded, or missing, and inflicts nearly as many losses on the Confederates. But aided by Porter's fleet, he disperses an entire rebel army and cuts the South supply line. Soon even the most basic goods like salt to preserve meat would grow increasingly scarce. Yet the Vicksburg campaign is overshadowed in the...
Phil, that's true. Once they were properly exchanged, if there were men to exchange them with in the North, they could go back and fight. But a lot of those men who fought at Vicksburg after their exchange, they were done. They went home and they didn't go back.
Pressed by the Confederate defeat at Gettysburg the day before. And only in the coming decades would Grant's accomplishment be recognized. Late into the 20th century, coalition forces in the First Gulf War were still using tactics inspired by Grant's Vicksburg campaign.
Oh, I can't wait to be there in a couple weeks. I'm so excited.
And it was at Vicksburg that the blue and the gray found unity in the cause of preservation. Their efforts resulted in the establishment of the Vicksburg National Military Park in 1899.
Interesting story, too, about Vicksburg, and we'll talk about this when I go there. The National Cemetery at Vicksburg is the largest collection of Union Civil War dead anywhere. There are more Union dead buried at the Vicksburg National Cemetery than any other national cemetery anywhere in the country. There's
Today,
the K-Row.
That preservation effort continues, so that the sacrifices made there by both sides will not be forgotten.
All right, so we used the American Battlefield Trust video. They're a fantastic organization. All my recent videos have a link to the donation, the fundraiser I'm doing to ask for money to help donate to the American Battlefield Trust. I believe very strongly in what they do, so please consider doing that. Thank you guys for joining me for this. We're going to get back to the reaction series on the story of the Ottoman Empire in the next couple of days. I've got some more original content I still have to get edited and up to you guys. I am definitely planning on visiting the USS K-Row. I'm going to visit everything I possibly can in Vicksburg in 4 days. I'm hoping to make as many as 15 videos for you guys of content from my trip to Vicksburg. So that'll be coming. You can go back and watch this whole video later. It'll be available on the channel. Thanks for watching, guys. We will see you again.